Okay, Job is a good man having a good life. And in the opening chapter of the book of Job, we get his character in verse 1. He's blameless. Now, we said that didn't mean he was sinless, but what we're going to find out is he's not to blame for what happens. And blameless here means how he is on the inside. And we saw that he's upright. And that means how he treats other people. So on the outside, he's good. And on the inside, he's good. What you see is what you get. And he fears God, and he turns from evil. And that means he reveres God. He holds God in reverence. So, in the first verse, we have Job's character, and then we have the actions of Job, how he lives. He's a wealthy man. He's a family man, and he puts spiritual things first. And he's a mediator for his family. He goes out and offers sacrifices for them every day because they have feasts every day in case they sin in their heart. And he's the greatest man of the East. He's a leader. He's a ruler. He's an important individual in the community. But then one day his entire world collapses. Everything goes wrong. Now, on the day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking and wine at their oldest brother's house, remember it said that they had a feast every single day, 7 days a week? A messenger came to Job and said the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabeans attacked and took them. And they also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another came and said, the Chaldeans formed these 3 bands and made a raid on the camels, and they slew them with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was speaking, another came and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking and wine, and the oldest of the brothers of the house. And behold, a great wind came across the land in the wilderness and struck the corners of the house and fell on the young people, and they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Everything this great, God-fearing man had accumulated and done in his life has been sacrificed, and that he has sacrificed for is now gone and destroyed. Every single thing that he has ever done, and none of it is his fault. And he has no idea what happens. One of the important things that we need to carry with us as we go through the book of Job is that Job does not know about the conversation that took place between Satan and God in heaven. We have to remember that. And we're going to make a list of things that we need to remember as we go through, because these things are not told to us for no reason. They're told to us so we'll understand what Job and his friends are struggling with. So we're going to make a list, but that's one of them that we have to do. So what's Job do? Then Job arose, and he tore his robe, and he shaved his head, and he fell to the ground, and he worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And through all this, Job did not sin, and he did not blame God. Some of your translations might say he did not charge God with wrong. So here we are already anticipating the end of the book of Job. Right speaking about God is fundamentally important in the book of Job, and it's fundamentally important to us. We need to speak correctly about God and not say things that God is doing that God is not doing, and not blame God for things that are happening that God did not cause. We have to speak properly about God. So at the end of the book, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your 2 friends, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So the problem all the way through is that Job's friends, Job's counselors, are going to speak wrongly, not just against Job, but they're going to speak wrongly about God. And this is going to be the problem. And it's not a slight thing. It brings about the wrath of God. So what we have here is a real dilemma of faith. I believe in God, and I can't live like this. I've trusted God. I've done what God has said. I believe in God. I've faithfully followed God. But I can't believe this is happening. And so we sing that song, tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long. While there are others living in sin, never molested, though in the wrong. Why are we treated poorly when evil people who do not believe in God are sometimes treated good? Now, Job arose and he tore his robe and he shaved his head. Who does Job say is responsible for all of this loss and destruction in his life? Who took it all away? Who does Job say took it all away? The Lord. But then he said, blessed be the name of the Lord. Does that not sound like some kind of a contradiction? Why can Job say that the Lord took it away? Why does he think the Lord took it away? Because he gave it to him. Because God is sovereign. He believes that God is sovereign. He believes that God is the ruler. He believes that nothing can happen without God saying so. Therefore, God must have taken it away. And also, he doesn't know that Satan was involved in this decision. So, is he right in saying that God took it away? Yes. God took it away. God took it away. And we'll see that a little bit clearer, I hope. So he blames God for this, but he does not charge God with wrongdoing. And that's a tough one. That's a tough one for Christians, and that's one of the biggest problems for people to believe in God today. If God is good and he's all powerful, why is this world such a mess? Why is there such suffering? Even among the saints. So Job is making a statement here that he believes that God is sovereign and he will not charge what is wrong to God. He's going to question why God's doing it. And that's why we need to know that Job is blameless, and Job knows that he's blameless. Because he's not going to go to God and say, make it stop. He's going to go to God and say, why is it happening? And he says, you and I need to talk. And how am I going to talk to God? That's what Job's position is going to be. So he does not know the accusation that was made against him by the accuser, by the Satan. He does not know that he has been accused of something. He blames God. God took all this from me, and God brought all this suffering. He said God is responsible because God is in ultimate control, and God is sovereign. There is none higher. It all rests at the foot of God. And his friends also believe this. Everybody in the book of Job believes in God and believes that God is sovereign and believes that God has done this. They're all on the same side there. The accusations are going to come forth that Job must have done something wrong, that God wouldn't have done this to someone innocent. And there becomes the argument between Job and his friends. Job says, I'm innocent, and God did this to me. This is innocent suffering. And his friends say, God doesn't do innocent suffering. You must have done something wrong. And so we're going to learn something about undeserved suffering. And it's going to help us to see undeserved grace. So we got to follow this kind of carefully. And in the next week, we're going to start speeding up because we're going to get into the poetry section. And we're going to take it in bigger chunks and just see what the arguments are. But we need to lay this groundwork down first as this goes on. So, he says God did this, and he says God can do nothing wrong. And that's tough to see, because I don't like what's happening to me. Now, when my granddaughter, Nora, who's 14 now, was really little, we were going fishing. And we stopped at the bait shop to buy some worms. And we opened the little refrigerator they have there, and they had green worms and red worms. And I said, what should we get, green worms or red worms? And she said, green worms. And I thought, this is a good time to teach her a little mathematics and a little fiscal responsibility. Because with the red worms, I told her, we get 24 worms for $3. With the green worms, we get 12 worms for $6. Which ones should we get? And she said, the green worms. And I said, wait a minute, you don't understand. With the green worms, we get half as many, but they cost twice as much. And she said, Grandpa, but they're green. And I want to take that argument to God. This is happening in my life. I'm being punished. Job's being punished. The world is not the way I would run it. Why do I not lay that at the feet of God? Why do I not disbelieve in God? Why do I not criticize God? Because He's God. And this is the argument of Job. I don't like what he's doing. I need to talk. He needs to explain something to me, but He's still God. And remember we said that James is going to bring us out to the end and say the purpose of Job is that he's a prophet to show us that we have to have endurance until Jesus comes again. And so no matter what happens to us, no matter the struggles, no matter the pain, no matter what happens that we do not understand, God is still God, and we have to wait to the end. And that's a big message in Job. God is God. God is sovereign. And this is the way that Job is presented and the way that the book is presented to us. Now, Bill Maher misses the point. He said, let's face it, God has a big ego problem. Why do we always have to worship Him? He's put a human characteristic on God Almighty. Why do we have to worship Him? He's God. And so Bill Maher has spoken wrongly about God. And God said that brings His wrath. But the book of Job is not written for Bill Maher. The book of Job is written for believers. This is not a book for unbelievers. This is for people like you and us who are struggling and trying to get through life and trying to understand what God's doing. And all the way through the Bible, there's a whole concept that God's not telling us everything that He does, and that we can't understand everything that He does, that He has this massive amount of stuff going on, and He can't tell us. And He tells us a little bit once in a while. He pulls that curtain back and lets us know what's going on. He's going to do that at the end of Job. But right now, Job knows less than we do. Job knows less about it than we do, and yet he understands the sovereignty of God, and he does not give up on God as God. So, God must be worshiped. Meyer speaks wrongly about God. Job speaks rightly about God, and he worships God. I saw those people on the news in the Houston hurricane. And the wind's blowing and it's raining, and they have no idea if they've lost their house or their car or their boat or their business or their school or their church building. And they're all jammed in to this gymnasium. And somebody in the middle, some lady in the middle, starts singing praises to God, and nearly the whole place joined in. I have trouble grasping that. I got my ear pinned next to the radio to find out if my house is there, if my family's there, if people are safe. And we still have people who are in Job's condition praising God because He's God. And we don't have an answer to all of these things. This is the great dilemma of our day. This is the difficult question that's posed to us by the unbelievers. If God is good and powerful, why do bad things happen? Why doesn't God just fix these things and stop these things? Why does He let people suffer? Why does He let there be earthquakes and typhoons and tsunamis? Why does He let children suffer? Why do these things go on? And that's a hard question, and I think a legitimate question. So if God is all-powerful and bad things happen, then God cannot be good. And therefore, there is no God. And if there is a God, He's evil. That's the main argument against God by atheists today. So we have to look at Job as a Christian book. It's not a book for unbelievers, it's a book for believers. Job is dealing with a specific thing and a specific person for us to look at. He's not first and foremost talking about us. So usually what happens, we go put Job in there and go, yeah, something like that happened to me. That's not the application that we're supposed to make. Job is a true believer, and this is not a general book on sin and suffering, but it's the faith of a true believer in God who is suffering innocently. And it brings us about to a description of God. So, Job is not, first of all, written about me. Job is written for me. But it is written about Job and his relationship with his God. And that's why I am told that Job does not know what's going on. Job doesn't know what's going on, but I do. So we are led into this because it's not written for Job. It's written about Job. It's written for me. So it's the same situation in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 when Paul says, all these things happen to them for your instructions. So this is a real story about a real man, something that happened to him in the very extreme. And it happened to him for my instruction. So first of all, we have to look at what God's doing, the reactions of the people in the story, and we learn from that. And that means it's written for us. That's why in the beginning he tells us that Job's blameless, and that Job has all these things, and that Job is being put to the test by Satan, and that God is being put to the test by Satan, which we looked at the last couple of weeks. So, I want to put up Jim's graphic here. On Wednesday night, when Jim teaches this class, he always brings up, or he often brings up this graphic, and what it does is it shows us the proper direction that we are supposed to study. So the first thing we look at when we open a passage of Scripture is, how does it fit into the Bible context? The whole Bible story and the immediate context. We always want to look at the context of what's being talked about there. And then he says, what's revealed about human nature? This Job really fits that. We're going to see what does it reveal about human nature, because Job's going to say things that I don't know how he got away with, and he didn't get an answer to, and Job's friends are going to say the things that I probably would have said, and so I have to sort that out. And so what is revealed about human nature? And then we always take it to Jesus. We always have to see what's revealed about Jesus, because Jesus said the whole Bible's about me. And then, and only then, do we make our application. Here's where preachers, teachers, and Bible students often go wrong. We start with the application. I want to know about this, and then we go to the Bible and try to find it. We're going to find whatever we want to find. What we want to do is open the book first, and then have everything come up out of that book to teach us. And then, and only then, do we find the application for our life. We want to do that with Job too. This week, at the end or the beginning of next week, we're going to actually try to draw an application of what does this have to do with us. But first, we want to make sure that we understand what the story is doing. So Job is a true believer in pain and in a relationship with God. And Job is an extreme case to present our understanding of God, of how God runs his world. And so the title of our class is, If I Were God, This Is How I Would Do It. Do you ever have anybody that does that to you no matter what? You buy a car. If I was buying a car, I wouldn't have bought it there. I'd have bought it over here, and I could have got you. You ever have a guy that no matter what you do? I bought a car one time. I worked with a guy like that, and I bought a car one time. And all the guys said, you know, so-and-so is going to come up here, and he's going to tell you you should have got a better deal. So I'm thinking I paid back then probably $11,000 for the car, back when cars cost $11,000. So when the guy came in, he goes, how much you pay for that car? I said, $6,500. And you know what he said? I could have got you a better deal. So we're always going to be telling somebody how to do something better. And I've known some guys, they always know better. You should have done this, you should have done that. So you never give them any information. I actually worked with a guy one time, and he had a lot of diseases and a lot of problems. He had an epilepsy, and he always had some disease. And whatever disease came up, he'd say, I got that, and here's the pill you take for it. But the guy really was something the matter with him. He'd walk down the aisle and walk right into a post every once in a while and fall down. They'd put him on a stretcher and haul him out, and he'd be back in a few days. I walked in there one day, and I had wrenched my back and was just about on my hands and knees trying to go to work. And I said, watch this. When he comes in, I bet he had it. So he comes in and he said, what do you have? And I made up a word about that long that didn't even exist. And he goes, I had that. It didn't even exist. So we're going to see Job in things that do exist. And then we're going to draw the application out of that. But we don't want to be the people like Job and Job's friends. They like the way the world's being run, because Job's a mess and they're doing okay. But Job doesn't like how God's running the world. And if I were God, what would I do in this situation? So that's kind of the title to our class. If I were God, I wouldn't have done that. But Job doesn't even know what's happened. Job's completely in the dark as to why any of this is going on. And Paul then, Job tells us, the book of Job, the author of Job tells us some of what's going on. And we get to the book of Ephesians, Paul's going to tell them some of the stuff that's going on so that they don't lose heart. God has this under control, but there's powers and principalities, but Jesus is on the throne. And that's the whole book of Revelation. The whole book of Revelation is, here's what's going on. Jesus is on the throne. There's going to be this pestilence, but Jesus is on the throne. There are saints that have died for believing and speaking that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, but they're under the throne. And we need to know that because we don't know everything that is going on. The whole book of Job is so that we do not give up and so that we have endurance. Now, last week we saw that the accuser had been roaming the earth looking for someone to accuse. And God points out Job. He says, have you seen my servant Job? And as Tom Twigg said last week, he calls him his servant, which is a name that's reserved for Moses, a name that's reserved for Jesus. This is my servant. This is a title. This is an endearment. This is a man of faith. So Job is the greatest man, and he has a name that's reserved for Moses and for Jesus. The greatest became a servant. And so we saw last week that Satan's accusations were twofold. One was, he said, Job worships God so that God will give him stuff. The only reason he's worshiping you is so that he gets stuff. Well, anybody would worship you if it was a direct relation like that. And then his second accusation was, God gives Job stuff so that Job will worship him. It's the same thing. The only reason he worships you is you build a hedge around him and you've given him everything that he wants. Of course he's going to worship you. That's the accusation. That's the wealth gospel. That's the prosperity gospel that's preached so much in the world today. Satan says, this is what's going on. God said, no, it's not. My true worshipers don't worship me for their prosperity. The prosperity gospel is damned right here in the book of Job, and it's time for preachers to stop preaching it. But it's preached all over the networks. It's preached all over the place, and it creeps into our churches also, and our Bible study and our thinking, that we receive these blessings because we believe in God. Job didn't get anything, and he's a servant and faithful to God. And this is also Bill Maher's position. He says, God knows life is horrible. It's right there in the Bible. The book of Job is all about Job asking God to take the pain away. And God says, I can't take the pain and misery because no one would talk to me. That's the exact opposite of what the book of Job is about. The exact opposite of what it is about. And Bill Maher has that wrong. That's the accusation by the accuser, who is Satan. God says it's not true. God says Job is blameless, and he's upright, and he fears God, and he turns from evil, and he calls Job his servant. So, Job has a reverence from God that has absolutely no strings attached. He's not living this way so that he can have the good life now. He will have a nice home. He will have a nice family. He will have money in the bank. That's not why he's living for God. That's not why he reveres God or worships God or turns from evil. He does it because God is God. Just like green worms are more expensive than red worms. Because of who he is, that's why he worships him. Now, Jim was bringing this out in Wednesday night class when he got to the part about the loaves and the fishes. And he asked a question right at the end of class, and it really didn't get finished off. He says, Jesus came up and he says, if I didn't give you the loaves and fishes, what would you do? And so he asked us the question in class, if there was no heaven, would you still follow Jesus? And most of the class stopped and said, I don't know. That's the wrong answer. That's the answer that Jim wasn't looking for. That's the answer that God's not looking for. That's the answer that Satan's looking for. If there was no heaven, Would you still worship God? Would you still follow Jesus? Why? Because he's Jesus. Because God is God. We fail to grasp that. It changes everything on how we function. So, Job then becomes a type of Christ. And we looked at that a little bit last week. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he would see his offspring and prolong his days. Now, there's a verse change here. But I want to put these two together. I think these two go together. And the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand as a result of the anguish of his soul. How does the good pleasure prosper through the anguish of his soul? How is Job ever going to be purified without the anguish of his soul? Job's going to bring that up. Peter's going to say it's true. That you want to be like gold in God's eyes? You're going to have to go under the pressure and the fire to become gold. That's one of the purposes that's going through here. And so he becomes numbered with the transgressors. And he intercedes for the transgressors. And that's what Job has. Job looks like a sinner. If you believe in God and God gives you good stuff and you go see Job sitting there with this mess, Job looks like a sinner. He's numbered with the transgressors, but he's blameless. In fact, he himself interceded for his children. So, here we have Job as a type of Christ. He's the greatest of men. He's the servant. He's crushed. He looks like a sinner even though he's blameless. And they're going to call Jesus a sinner just like they call Job a sinner. So why do we fear God? Why do we go to church? Why do we do church the way that we do church? Because God is God. And we must never move away from that. God is God, and we do what he says because of who he is. Now, the church and preaching and teaching and practicing in many places has become about self-help groups and service clubs and entertainment and attracting people and making it more like the society so that people will feel more welcome and want to come to it. And what I can get out of it and making my life better and therapeutic moralism. And youth groups come around and they try to make better kids. But in making better kids, they don't always make Christians. We can make them better kids. They don't drink, they don't smoke, they don't drive fast. We're breaking them of that. But we don't always present Jesus. And we don't always present the Christianity that they have to grasp. And they can go out and be good kids and not be Christians. So the fundamental question that's often overlooked is, why are we doing all of this? Worship is not about pleasing us. God's glory is not dependent on my happiness. And this is hard. Job's hard. This is hard. And we often get that backwards, even for a little while. Sometimes we forget that something really, really important happens when we step in this building and we praise our God. We can't move from that. It's never about us. So we need to think about the accusation. This is what the book of Job is about. And one of the biggest problems in Christianity and preaching and teaching today is we get that backwards. We want to see what we can get out of it. And we're going to get nothing out of it until we put God into it. So God asked the accuser what he's been doing. And the accuser says he's been roaming around on the earth. And your translation might say, I've just been going to and fro. And so it appears that he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. And God does not say, what are you doing here? When he comes up, the sons of God, this council comes up before God, and he doesn't say, what are you doing here? And when he says, when I was roaming around on earth, he doesn't say, why were you doing that? Satan is doing what he's supposed to be doing here. He's supposed to be the prosecutor. But we find out that he's now become the evil prosecutor. He's prosecuting the innocent. And so when we have a false prosecutor, things really go bad. Well, while you were walking around on the earth looking for someone, did you notice Job, who's blameless and who does nothing wrong, and he's my servant? And then he gives Job the permission. He said, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. Now, if I was running the world, if I were God, and he came up and he says, I need to take everything away from Job, I'd say, get out of here. I would not allow that. If I were God, I would not allow that. So when I make God in my image, I don't like what God's doing here. But this was written for our instruction, and we have to stay with it to find out what's going on. But if I were God, that's not how I would have handled it. But there is one thing important to see here. And this is really important, and we sometimes miss this. That even though Satan is given permission to do some horrible, horrible things, he cannot act without that permission. The hand of Satan cannot move without the hand of God. Satan's going to do some bad things, and he's doing some bad things today, but he still cannot act any farther than God allows him to go. I used to go for a walk, and I'd go down this one road, and there was a dog there, and I took a picture of him one day, and I don't have that picture, but I got a picture of a dog that looked just like him. And I would forget that he was there. I got my headphones on, and I'm bebopping along, trying to get some exercise here and enjoying the day, and he's chained to a tree right absolutely next to the road, and just grabbed my chest. That's what he looked like right there. But the thing you can never remember is he's got that chain. That's Satan. That's Satan right there. But he's got a chain around his neck. And God says, no, that's as far as you can go. Now, it looks like God's letting him go farther than I would have. But no matter what is going on, Satan can't go any farther than God allows him to go. So the important thing to notice here is that God has control, and Satan cannot operate without permission. God has Satan on a leash. And it looks bad, and it's going to be frightening, and we're going to get into terrible situations and punishments and persecutions, but we still, like Job, have to know God is still God, and he's in his heaven, and he's still in control. He is sovereign. And so the sovereignty of God does not mean that he runs everything himself. We saw that. He has a hierarchy that goes on. And Ephesians and Revelation and other places are going to point that out. There's this big unseen world that we never see and we don't know anything about. And we have to trust that God has all of those things under control, and we must never forget that. And Satan is not a rival God. He's not equal with God. Even though he's doing some powerful things, he's not equal with God. He's no challenge to God. He's a created being. And Job has lots of questions. And some of the questions are going to be pointed, and some of the questions are going to accuse God of certain things. But he's never going to ask the question, is God God? And there's where we need to settle in. We have to always remember that God is God. And no matter what is going on, and no matter what questions we may have, or no matter what trials we have, or persecutions, or when we want to quit, we have to always go back and say, God is God. And he's sovereign, and he's powerful, and he loves us, and he brought Jesus into the world to save us. And all of these other things, no matter how bad they are secondary to understanding that God is God. Now, Satan said that Job would curse God, but Job blesses God. And Job had been watching over his kids that they not curse God in their hearts, and that they not do it verbally with their lips. But it should be the end of the story. If I was writing a story and it said Job was a good man, he watched out for his kids, Satan came up and said, I'd like to test him, and I don't think he's really true, and God would say, be gone, Satan. And that should be the whole story, 2 chapters. Should be a chapter. But it's not. Now we got 40 chapters to go to try to explain what's going on here. If I were God, I'd put a stop to this right now. And if I did allow it to happen, if I were God, I would explain it all to Job. Hey, things are going to get bad for a while. I got this. Just hang on to the end. He doesn't even get that. Job doesn't even get that. Here's where we learn from Job. God's God. And I'm not going to let what I see, what I think, the philosophies of the world, the destructions of the world, what I actually witness with my eyes and feel in my body, I'm not going to allow that to change the fact that God is God. But it gets worse. It gets worse. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present themselves before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" And then Satan said to the Lord, "From roaming around the earth and walking around it." It's just like the last time. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there's no one like him. He's blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil." This is the exact same thing that was said about him. This is the third time this has been said about him. "And he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." Now God is telling Satan what he actually did. Satan didn't come in and say, "I think he's going to fail." Satan says, "I'm going to destroy him." Satan's not here to test him. He's here to destroy God's servant. And so in verse 3, he says, "He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him without cause." And so this means you instigated against him. And without cause, because Job's blameless. You didn't really have a reason to do that. Job does not love God for what God can give him. And so the suffering for Job is without cause. Now, one of the other translations, actually the Septuagint says it a little bit different. And basically it says, you did this to him and you failed. So it takes that from the Hebrew and puts it into the Greek, and the way they translated it, it actually comes out and it doesn't say that you incited me without cause. It is, you did this against him without success. So there's a little bit of a different idea there as to how that might have been translated, and either one of them are good. So Job is a true believer, not of the prosperity gospel and not of the health gospel. He's a true believer. And we see now what Satan wants. He doesn't want to tempt him. He wants to destroy him. So, Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and flesh, and he will curse you to his face." So the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your power. Spare his life." So he's given a lot, but he's yanked at the chain from killing him. And so here we actually have something that we hear people say. They go on the news and their house just burned to the ground and everybody got out and a tornado came through and ripped through the neighborhood, and they all say, "Well, at least we have our health." I can't say that. You know, look on the bright side. I don't like it when people come up and say, "You think that's bad? This guy's got it worse over there." "I don't care right now. I got it this bad." It's always about me. It's always about my pain and my suffering and my loss and my inconvenience. But these people actually, yeah, we got all the kids out. But at that point, they probably thought they were going to lose them all. And so they are thankful. Skin for skin. So there's a difference now between what a person has and what a person is. I can look around and I see that suffering in Puerto Rico, and I read it and I go, "Man, that's terrible. What's for breakfast?" But if I was there, and that was mine, and I was sick, and I was in a hospital that didn't have electricity or water, now I've got an involvement, a physical involvement with it, and that's different. There's one thing to have a material loss. There's another thing to have a health loss. Skin for skin. Man will do anything to try to stay alive. So the difference here between all that he has and all that he is sometimes gets confused. So the first attack that Satan has is the wealth gospel. The second attack that he has is the health gospel. When we preach the health and the wealth gospel, we're preaching what Satan preached. And that is not the gospel. And so now, then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Now our story begins, because he's going to sit there for the rest of the book. Any questions or comments?
I thought in the discussion between Satan and the Lord, you stated, I think, a couple weeks ago that it was like a And in any trial, I see that one, somebody's right, somebody's wrong. Somebody's telling the full truth, somebody's not. And so I think you have to walk away also with that conclusion, is that this discussion between Satan and God, either God is wrong and Satan is right, or Satan is right or wrong and God is right. And I think also too that God knows, and this goes to the nature of God, but God knows Job so well that he knows he will not give up his integrity.
All right, he knows that, and he knows it. It's almost like the judge knows the truth before it's presented.
Right.
But Job doesn't know that, and Job's going to ask for a mediator. I think Seth last week said, he used that passage of Scripture, I think it's in Job 9, where he says, I wish I had somebody that could lay their hand on both of us. That's a referee. You ever watch a boxing match or a kickboxing match, and when it gets down to the end, you got the referees always hanging on to both those guys. He's got a hold of a hand. He's touching them both. I need somebody that can touch us both. And then one of the hands is going in the air. He's talking referee. It's a wrestling match now. It's a wrestling match between him and God, and we're going to get to that. But you're right. There's a prosecutor going on, and there's a judge. But Job doesn't think that he's being treated fairly. He doesn't know the prosecutor is Satan. He thinks the prosecutor is God. And so he needs a defendant. He needs a mediator who can step between them, take hold of both of their hands, listen to their story, listen to the judges. They're going to have 3 judges there. They're going to say, he got this many points, he got this many points, he got this many points, and put his hand in the air. Job's looking for a referee. And the referee's not between God and Satan. The referee's between Job and God. That's what we're going to see. The problem is because Job does not know this.
You know, I think I've told you before, when I was going through what I was going through, Job gave me a lot of strength. And even today, I think God chooses people that can show his glory. And that's what I got out of looking at from Job. Is like he was chosen as a vessel to show his glory and what he can do to the people.
I think that's true, but I think sometimes we need to be careful and say God did this. Remember I told the story of the 2 little girls that were hit by a car at the bus stop? They were 9 years old, one died, and the people that didn't go to church, their little girl died, and the other girl was in a full body cast, and then the guy that was making announcements got up and says God was watching out for her. And I was a little kid, and I'm thinking, he didn't do a very good job. You know, I don't want God watching out for me. She's in a body cast, and the other one. And what does that say to the other parents who lost their little girl? So I know exactly what you're saying, and I believe that's true. But I think we also always have to be careful of not assigning something that God is doing when we don't know. We know what God did in the past. He took Israel out of the Exodus. He put Jesus on the cross. He raised him from the dead. And we know what he's going to do in the future. The trump's going to sound, and the dead in Christ will rise, and we'll be forever with the Lord. But to assign what he's doing right now, and the reason I bring this up is because there's a group of what they call missional type movements and emergent church movements. And what they're saying is that we need to go out and look at the community around us and the world around us, and we'll see what the Holy Spirit's doing. And when we find that out, then we'll come in and join him. So these churches are just tumbling down a sewer because they're looking at atheists and Buddhists and alcoholics and all kinds of different groups, and they're saying, I see what God's doing. This is one of the things that some of the missional movements are doing, and they come out, and this is their statement. We'll go out and we'll canvass. We'll find out what God is doing, and then we'll join him. It's in their books, and they're preaching this, and they're teaching it in our Christian colleges to our preachers. So we don't know what God is doing. We know what God did. We preach this, and we proclaim that at the end. But we don't say, I know what God is doing. Now we've gone to the one thing that Job's friends have done. Job's friends are going to say, I know what God's doing. And he's not. They're wrong. And Job's going to say, I don't know what God's doing, but I don't like it, and I want to talk to him, and I need a mediator. And Job never sins against God with his lips. Thanks for coming.